The spring of 1945 was a season of collapse. Across the ravaged fields and broken cities of Germany, the once mighty Wehrmacht was retreating in tatters. The Reich that Adolf Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was crumbling in less than 12. And for countless German soldiers, the final battle was no longer about victory, but survival. Along the Western Front, something extraordinary was happening. Columns of German troops, some in full uniform, others in tattered coats stolen from civilians, were streaming toward American lines with white flags raised high. Some fashioned flags from bedsheets, others tore strips of cloth from their shirts. They shouted, "Kamerad! Kamerad!" as they dropped rifles, machine guns, even their helmets into roadside ditches. They stumbled forward with hands in the air, begging not to be shot. These were not isolated cases. In village after village, along country roads, and even in the shadow of Allied artillery, German soldiers deserted en masse, not to flee home, not to regroup for a last stand, but to surrender. And not just to anyone. They weren't rushing eastward toward the Red Army. They weren't laying down their arms for Soviet patrols. They were desperately seeking out Americans. For those who lived through it, the image was unforgettable. The very men who had once sworn an oath to fight to the last bullet, now pleading for a cage on the other side of barbed wire. Men who had mocked the Americans as soft and decadent were suddenly throwing themselves at their mercy. Why? The answer is more complicated and more revealing than it first appears. At its core was fear. The German army had committed unspeakable atrocities on the Eastern Front, and its soldiers knew exactly what awaited them if they fell into Soviet hands. Stories of Siberian camps, mass executions, and starvation filtered back through the ranks. To surrender to the Red Army was to risk a death march east, never to return. But fear alone cannot explain the desperation. There was also something else. Rumors that spread like wildfire through German units. Tales of American prisoner camps where soldiers were given real food, clean clothes, and medical treatment. Stories that some POWs were even allowed to write letters home or work on farms for pay. Whispers that American soldiers handed out cigarettes, chocolate, even Coca-Cola. To men who had gone months on turnip soup and black bread, this was unimaginable. And so surrendering to America became not only acceptable, but desirable. It was not a humiliation, it was a lifeline. The dramatic question hangs in the air. What made captivity under the Americans not just tolerable, but something German soldiers actively sought out, sometimes risking their lives to reach it? The answer lies in the collapse of Nazi propaganda, the sheer contrast between East and West, and the extraordinary role that America's industrial abundance played in reshaping the psychology of war. This is the story of how, in the dying days of the Third Reich, thousands of German soldiers begged to surrender, not out of cowardice, but out of desperation, calculation, and the faint hope that in American hands there might still be a future that began, ironically, not with victory, but with surrender. By early 1945, the German Reich was living on borrowed time. Entire cities lay in rubble, their skylines reduced to jagged outlines of chimneys and church spires. Railways had been torn apart by relentless bombing. Factories stood gutted, and fields once golden with wheat were now churned mud or frozen wastelands scarred by tank tracks. The German people were starving, their children pale and thin, their rations shrinking with each passing week. Two vast armies were closing in. From the east, the Red Army surged forward, burning with a desire for revenge after 4 years of devastation. From the west, the British, Canadians, and above all the Americans pushed across the Rhine, their convoys stretching horizon to horizon. The war was lost, but the question for German soldiers was no longer whether to fight, but where to surrender, and to whom. For years, Nazi propaganda had hammered home a single message: surrender was dishonor. A true German soldier was to fight to the last bullet, to prefer death over captivity. Posters and broadcasts described American and British forces as decadent, racially divided, too soft to endure war. They were supposedly a mongrel people, wealthy, materialistic, and unwilling to make sacrifices. But as the war dragged on, cracks appeared in this illusion. German soldiers on the front lines began to hear rumors from comrades who had been captured and later exchanged, or from letters smuggled back through neutral countries. The Americans, it was said, obeyed the Geneva Convention. Prisoners received proper food, medical care, even mail from their families. In stark contrast stood the stories from the East. German divisions that had faced the Soviets knew all too well what their own army had done in Russia, burning villages, executing civilians, starving prisoners. Every soldier understood that the Red Army would not forgive. Captivity in the East meant hunger, brutal labor, and perhaps never returning home. And so, in the final months of the war, surrender was no longer a shameful word whispered only by cowards. It became a strategy of survival. German officers quietly directed their men to move westward, to seek out American lines rather than risk falling into Soviet hands. Some units even disobeyed orders, retreating not toward Berlin as commanded, but toward the Americans in the hope of being taken prisoner. The difference between East and West was more than rumor. It was visible in every town the Allies liberated. American convoys rolled in with trucks full of food, cigarettes, chocolate, and supplies. To exhausted German soldiers, these convoys seemed like visions from another world. It was not weakness they saw, but unimaginable abundance. This abundance shaped everything. The Americans did not merely fight with tanks and rifles, they fought with an economy that dwarfed Germany's. They could afford to treat prisoners well, to feed them, even to allow them small comforts. For German soldiers, this shattered years of propaganda. How could a decadent enemy show more humanity to them than their own leaders had shown to civilians in the East? By 1945, the choice seemed obvious. To be captured by the Soviets meant possible death. To be captured by the Americans meant food, shelter, and perhaps even dignity. And so, on the roads of Germany in that desperate spring, thousands of men who had once cheered Hitler now clutched white flags, praying not for victory, but for capture. This was not cowardice, it was survival. And for many, it was their first step into a new understanding of the world, one in which America's power was not just in its guns, but in its ability to overwhelm through generosity, order, and sheer industrial might. The fear of the Soviets haunted every German soldier in 1945. It was not an abstract anxiety, but a living terror fed by 4 years of brutality on the Eastern Front. No, one in the Wehrmacht was unaware of what their own army had done in the Soviet Union. From the moment Germany invaded in June 1941, the war in the East had been waged with a ferocity unmatched in the West. Cities like Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk had been razed. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were rounded up and executed. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were starved to death in camps or left to freeze in open fields. The Germans called it the Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation, and they knew that in 1945 the Red Army was bringing annihilation back to Germany itself. When Soviet troops surged across the Oder and into East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, news of what followed spread quickly. Civilians fled in long columns, dragging carts piled with belongings, children clinging to their sides. Soldiers who escaped capture whispered of atrocities, summary executions, rapes, forced marches into the depths of Russia. Rumors magnified the horror, but even the truth was terrifying enough. For German soldiers, surrender to the Red Army was often described in one stark phrase: better a bullet than Siberia. One Wehrmacht diary entry, found after its owner was killed near the Vistula, recorded his dread: "If captured, we go east. East means labor, hunger, death. Better to fall here with honor." The chilling part was that his fear was not exaggerated. Soviet camps, particularly those in Siberia, were notorious. Prisoners were packed into trains, shipped thousands of miles away, and set to work in mines, forests, or construction sites. Food was scarce, clothing inadequate, disease rampant. Survival was a matter of chance. German intelligence reported to its own troops that as many as half of all prisoners taken in 1941-42 had not survived their first winter in Soviet captivity. Whether the numbers were precise hardly mattered. The effect on morale was devastating. To a German soldier facing defeat in 1945, surrendering eastward seemed like a slow death sentence. This fear reshaped entire units. Officers who still preached loyalty to Hitler found their men quietly drifting westward whenever they could. Maps of the collapsing Reich show divisions peeling away from the eastern front lines, retreating not toward Berlin, but toward Bavaria, Hesse, or the Rhineland, anywhere the Americans might soon appear. There were moments of desperation that bordered on chaos. In one instance, recorded by Allied intelligence, an entire German battalion abandoned its defensive positions on the Oder, not because of the Soviets pressing them, but because they had heard that American forces were just 2 days' march away to the west. Soldiers slipped away in the night, throwing down their rifles, taking their chances on the roads clogged with refugees. Many were cut down by their own officers or by SS units trying to enforce discipline. Still, the desertions continued. The SS tried to stem this tide of fear with threats and propaganda. Posters declared, "Surrender is betrayal. To the west or east, you are doomed." But the soldiers knew better. They had spoken to comrades who had been captured in North Africa and later repatriated. They had read smuggled letters from men held in America, describing food parcels, work details, and even the chance to listen to music or watch films. By comparison, Soviet captivity seemed like a pit with no bottom. One striking testimony comes from a German lieutenant captured near Leipzig in April 1945. Interrogated by American officers, he explained why his entire company had chosen to surrender west. "We have seen Russia. We know what we did there. The Russians will not forgive us. But you Americans, you will treat us as men. And if we must spend the rest of the war in a cage, better that cage is here than a grave in Siberia." It is easy, decades later, to dismiss these choices as simple pragmatism. But for the soldiers themselves, it was a matter of raw survival instinct. To march toward the Americans was to choose life, however uncertain. To fall into Soviet hands was to embrace a nightmare they could scarcely imagine surviving. The statistics bear out this desperation. By war's end, roughly 3.3 million German soldiers had been taken prisoner by the Soviets. More than 1 million of them never returned. Many languished in camps for a decade after the war, only trickling back to Germany in the mid-1950s. By contrast, of the nearly 3.8 million German POWs taken by the Western Allies, The vast majority returned home within a few years. The numbers were not just figures. They were warnings whispered across the ranks. By 1945, German soldiers no longer dreamed of victory. They dreamed of reaching the Americans before the Soviets reached them. And that single thought, the fear of the Red Army, drove countless men to drop their weapons, tear strips of cloth for white flags, and march west with hands held high. The irony was staggering. The Wehrmacht had once defined itself by loyalty to Hitler, by discipline, by refusal to ever surrender. But in the war's final days, the most loyal act a soldier could perform for himself, his family, and his own survival was not to fight, but to give up, to beg for the chance to surrender to America. And once captured, many discovered that the rumors had been true. American captivity was nothing like what they had feared. In fact, for many, it was better than the lives they had left behind in Germany. When the first waves of German soldiers laid down their arms and marched into American custody, many expected humiliation, starvation, or even execution. They had been told all their lives that the Allies were brutal and vengeful, that capture meant torment. Instead, what they encountered was something they could scarcely believe. From the outset, American forces generally adhered to the Geneva Convention. German POWs were registered, given identification, and quickly moved away from the front. Instead of being beaten or left to die, they were transported in trucks, trains, and sometimes even ships across the Atlantic to camps in the United States. The sheer scale of this effort was staggering. By 1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners were living in America, scattered across camps in Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, Georgia, and dozens of other states. For the average German soldier, the shock began with the food. Meals in captivity included bread, meat, vegetables, and occasionally luxuries like fruit or even dessert. Prisoners later recalled the first time they were served white bread, something unavailable in Germany for years. One POW wrote, "We ate better in America than our families at home." Another remembered biting into a fresh apple and realizing with dismay that his children in Hamburg had not tasted fruit in years. Daily life in the camps quickly reinforced this sense of astonishment. Prisoners were housed in barracks with bunks, blankets, and access to medical care. They were expected to work, on farms, in lumber mills, or on construction details, but they were paid small wages, redeemable in camp canteens. With those wages, they could purchase soap, cigarettes, chocolate, or even Coca-Cola. The very idea that a prisoner could buy a soda while his homeland burned was almost incomprehensible. Entertainment was another revelation. Many camps had libraries, sports fields, and music programs. In some places, American guards allowed POWs to form orchestras or soccer teams. Photographs survive of German prisoners playing violins, conducting choirs, or kicking footballs across fields under the watch of armed sentries. In other camps, they watched American movies projected on makeshift screens, westerns, comedies, and musicals filled with color and sound. For men raised on Nazi propaganda, these glimpses of American culture were bewildering. Of course, conditions were not universally perfect. Some camps were overcrowded, and treatment could be harsh depending on location or circumstance. But compared to what Germans had heard, and compared especially to what they feared from the Soviets, American captivity seemed almost humane to the point of indulgence. Letters home reinforced the legend. Many prisoners were allowed to write to their families under supervision. These letters, heavily censored but genuine in tone, spread through German communities. A wife might receive a note saying her husband was alive, fed, and even working on a farm in Texas. Such news carried a powerful effect. Soldiers on the front lines heard whispers that captivity in America was not only survivable, but comfortable. Contrast is everything in war. In German-occupied territories, millions of Soviet prisoners had been deliberately starved to death. In stalags across the Reich, British and American POWs often survived only through Red Cross parcels. And yet here, captured Germans were eating meat, drinking coffee, and gaining weight. To the men who surrendered, it was as if the world had turned upside down. One anecdote captures this contrast vividly. In 1944, a group of German POWs captured in Normandy was brought to a camp in the American South. Expecting misery, they were shocked when local farmers greeted them with food and even asked for their help with the harvest. Within days, these same soldiers were working in fields, eating hearty lunches, and joking with their captors. One later wrote, "We were prisoners, but we felt like workers. It was as though the war had ended for us, and we had stepped into another world." This treatment was not accidental. American military leaders understood the value of following the Geneva Convention. It maintained moral high ground, encouraged German soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, and provided labor desperately needed on the home front. At the same time, it stood as a quiet but powerful weapon of psychological warfare. Every German who surrendered and lived to tell the tale undermined the lies of Nazi propaganda. For many prisoners, the cultural shock went deeper than food or shelter. They encountered a society unlike the one they had been raised to believe existed. In America, they saw racial diversity, even if imperfectly lived out. They met guards who were polite, even friendly. They listened to jazz on radios, watched baseball games, and discovered that Americans laughed, joked, and lived with an ease they had never imagined. To To men raised in a totalitarian state, where every moment was controlled and every thought policed, the contrast was impossible to ignore. One POW described his realization bluntly: "We were told America was weak, but weak men do not build camps like these. Weak men do not treat their enemies with such strength of will. We saw then that everything we believed was wrong." For soldiers on the front, these stories mattered. Rumors spread faster than orders. Men who had once sworn to fight to the last bullet now clutched at any opportunity to wave a white flag, because the cage they entered on the other side of the Atlantic was safer, fuller, and even more hopeful than the homes they had left behind. It was, in many ways, the beginning of the collapse of Nazi propaganda itself. The Reich had told them Americans were decadent cowards. The camps told them Americans were rich, confident, and powerful. But if captivity in America surprised them, the true shock was still to come. The collapse of everything they had believed about their enemy, and the realization that surrender was not the end of life, but the beginning of a new way of seeing the world. By 1944-45, the pillars of Nazi propaganda were collapsing. For years, German soldiers had been told that America was a weak nation of indulgent civilians, unfit for war. Radio broadcasts mocked Americans as soft cowboys who relied on machines instead of discipline. Posters portrayed them as racially impure, torn by social division, incapable of enduring hardship. This narrative had worked for a time, convincing many Germans that victory was inevitable. But captivity told a different story. The first shock came from abundance. German POWs were astonished to discover that, even in wartime, Americans lived with luxuries that ordinary Germans had not seen in years. Cigarettes, chocolate, and Coca-Cola were commonplace in U.S. camps. Soldiers who had gone months without sugar suddenly found themselves sipping sweet soda from glass bottles. To men whose families were scraping together meals from turnips and ersatz flour, this was a revelation. One prisoner later recalled his disbelief. "We were fighting men who could give their prisoners chocolate. How could we hope to win against such wealth?" The image of America as decadent weakness was replaced with something far more intimidating. Prosperity so vast, it spilled over even to the enemy. Another cultural shock came from music. In camps across Texas, Oklahoma, and Iowa, prisoners heard American jazz, swing, and country drifting over radios. To them, music was not a triviality. It was proof of vitality. In Germany, jazz and swing had been banned as degenerate. In America, it was celebrated, broadcast freely, even shared with prisoners. Some POWs described the surreal experience of watching guards dance to records, or hearing Glenn Miller's band on the radio. For men raised in a culture of rigid marches and martial songs, the sound of improvisation and joy was disarming. Even the simple presence of books and films in camps carried weight. Some camps organized screenings of American movies, comedies, musicals, and dramas filled with laughter and color. German prisoners, who had been told that Americans lacked culture, sat transfixed by these productions. For many, it was their first exposure to Hollywood, and it left an indelible impression. The irony was striking. The very enemy they had been taught to despise now appeared as a model of energy, abundance, and modernity. Nazi propaganda had warned them that surrender would bring humiliation. Instead, captivity brought revelations that shook their worldview. Letters and memoirs from former prisoners reflect this transformation. One German officer wrote after the war, "We discovered in captivity that the Americans were not what we had been told. They were strong, organized, and strangely kind. It was then we realized our leaders had lied to us from the beginning." Some POWs began actively seeking capture. Accounts describe soldiers marching miles across battle-scarred countryside, not to regroup with their units, but to find an American patrol to surrender to. Others risked being shot by their own officers or SS enforcers just to wave a white flag when U.S. troops appeared. In the chaos of April 1945, it was not uncommon to see German columns breaking apart, with groups splintering off to head west rather than east. The decision was not made lightly. Surrender carried risk. German military courts still executed men for desertion. SS units patrolled roads and shot soldiers caught trying to flee, yet thousands took the chance, calculating that even death at the hands of their own officers was preferable to Soviet captivity. America represented life, perhaps even dignity. To the Americans, this wave of surrender was more than a logistical challenge. It became a powerful symbol of victory. Every German who threw down his rifle and walked willingly into an American camp was proof that Hitler's myths were unraveling. Propaganda had promised Germans that the Reich was unbreakable, that its soldiers were invincible. Yet here were those same soldiers, begging for a chance to live under American guard. One captured sergeant put it bluntly. "We did not fight for Hitler at the end. We fought to reach the Americans before the Russians reached us." This shift in perspective had profound consequences. The collapse of Nazi propaganda was not just political, it was personal. German soldiers began to understand that the world beyond their borders was larger, wealthier, and freer than they had ever imagined. The white flags they carried in 1945 symbolized not only defeat, but awakening. Even after the war ended, many former POWs carried these memories with them. Some later returned to America as immigrants, seeking the life they had glimpsed behind the wire. Others spoke to their children of the strange kindness of their captors, the food, the music, the laughter they had seen in enemy camps. For them, surrender had been not just survival, but transformation. By the time Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, surrender to America was no longer a humiliation. It was a choice, an act of will, and in many cases, a desperate hope for the future. But the most dramatic expression of this transformation would come in the war's final weeks, when entire roads and villages overflowed with German soldiers, throwing away their weapons, rushing not to defend their homeland, but to reach American lines first. April 1945. The Reich was collapsing into chaos. Roads across central Germany were choked with a strange procession. Not just refugees dragging carts of belongings, but entire columns of German soldiers moving westward with their weapons, slung low or discarded altogether. Horses pulled wagons piled high with wounded men. Civilians wept as they shuffled past, and weaving through it all were Wehrmacht troops, not preparing to fight, but searching for American lines. It was a scene of desperation. Overhead, Allied planes crisscrossed the skies. In the east, the thunder of Soviet artillery drew closer each day. The Red Army was advancing with a vengeance, and the Germans knew what awaited them if captured there. To the west lay the Americans, and to them the Germans pinned their hopes. On one country road outside of Leipzig, a company of Wehrmacht soldiers abandoned their defensive positions and streamed toward the sound of American tanks. White flags fluttered from rifle barrels, bedsheets, even children's dresses tied to sticks. Some men held their hands high, others clasped rosaries or small family photos. Their boots clattered against the cobblestones, a chorus of fear and relief all at once. American GIs, wary of trickery, stood at the edge of a small village watching the spectacle unfold. They had expected resistance, perhaps an ambush. Instead, they saw scores of German soldiers laying down rifles in ditches, tossing away belts and helmets, stumbling forward with the unmistakable look of men who wanted nothing more than to live. One GI later recalled, "They weren't fighting anymore. They were running to us. They looked at us like we were salvation itself." Among the Germans, whispers passed quickly. "Don't shoot. They are Americans. They will feed us." Others murmured the dreaded alternative. "If the Russians catch us, we are dead." Some POWs would later admit that they begged their officers to lead them westward rather than east. In more than one case, men defied orders, breaking away from their units and sprinting across open fields toward American lines, even while under fire from their own comrades or SS units enforcing discipline. In one dramatic incident near the Elbe River, a group of German soldiers ran headlong toward an American checkpoint, waving scraps of white cloth, while SS guards fired at them from behind. Several fell, struck down by their own countrymen, but the rest reached the Americans, collapsing in exhaustion and relief. "Better to die here than in Siberia," one of them gasped before being taken into custody. For American soldiers, the sight was both surreal and sobering. They were used to hard fighting, to ambushes and minefields. Now, in the war's final weeks, they saw their enemy transformed into supplicants. Proud men of the Wehrmacht, once the spearhead of Hitler's armies, now begged to be locked behind barbed wire. One German lieutenant, captured with his men, summed up the mood with a whisper to his captors. "Better to live in America as a prisoner than die in Russia as a slave." The emotional weight of these moments was immense. For the Americans, it was proof that the war was truly ending, that their overwhelming power and humanity had broken the will of the enemy. For the Germans, it was the final collapse of pride, a recognition that survival lay not in fighting, but in surrender. The image of those days remains etched in memory. Endless roads of weary soldiers discarding their weapons, clutching white flags, eyes fixed not on their homeland but on the West, toward captivity, toward America, toward life. By the final weeks of 1945, the war in Europe was no longer about conquest or glory. For German soldiers, it was about choosing who would hold their fate. And time after time, the choice was clear. They turned west. They sought out American patrols, clutched white flags, and begged for the safety of captivity. What drove them was more than fear of the Red Army, though that fear was immense. It was also the realization that everything they had been told about the United States was a lie. Propaganda had painted America as weak, decadent, incapable of fighting a serious war. But in the camps and on the roads, German soldiers saw the opposite. Strength not just in weapons, but in abundance, in confidence, in the simple ability to feed even their enemies. The contrast was crushing. On one side, the Soviets offered revenge, forced labor, and the terrifying uncertainty of Siberian camps. On the other, the Americans offered food, shelter, and treatment that, while not perfect, was humane by the standards of the time. For men exhausted by years of bloodshed, the difference meant everything. POW testimonies after the war make this clear. Many admitted that surrender to America was not humiliation, but relief. And we knew the war was lost, one soldier recalled, but in American hands, we felt we could still live. Another wrote, "It was strange. We were prisoners, but for the first time in years, we had hope." The story reveals something larger about the Second World War. Victory was not achieved by weapons alone. It was also won through industry, logistics, and morale. America could afford to build not just tanks and planes, but camps, food supplies, and even small comforts for prisoners. That abundance became a quiet but powerful form of psychological warfare. For every German who surrendered willingly, the myth of Nazi strength withered a little more. In many ways, the surrender of German troops to America symbolized the collapse of the Reich itself. It showed that loyalty to Hitler had eroded, that survival outweighed ideology, and that the illusions built on propaganda had been shattered by reality. In their final choice, German soldiers revealed the true balance of power, not on the battlefield, but in the ability of one nation to sustain life while another collapsed into ruin. The legacy of this story stretched beyond 1945. Many German POWs carried their memories of America back home. Some returned as immigrants years later, drawn by the glimpses of freedom and prosperity they had seen behind the wire. Others spoke of their captivity not as punishment, but as the moment they realized the world was larger than Nazi lies. And so, the question, why did German POWs beg to surrender to America in 1945? Has an answer both simple and profound. They begged because they wanted to live. They begged because they feared the Soviets. But above all, they begged because America's strength was not only in its guns, but in its humanity, its ability to overwhelm with abundance, and its refusal to treat enemies as less than human. Wars are remembered for their battles, for their heroes and tragedies, but sometimes the most revealing moments are quieter. The sight of men once proud and defiant now clutching white flags, pleading not for victory but for survival. And this story was not the end. It was the beginning of another chapter, how those German POWs carried their experiences home, reshaping how a generation saw America, not as an enemy, but as a model. A story we'll explore next in how German POWs brought American culture back to Europe after the war.